Good afternoon, students. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We are happy to have Dr. Natalie St. Corcoran, who's the director of the Eberly Writing Studio, to be here this afternoon to share with us how to write teaching statements. But before I turn the time over to her, I'm Dr. Betty May. I'm the Program Director for Graduate Student Success from the Office of Graduate Education and Life. We like to hear from you students about what kind of professional development workshops you would like to see us host. So feel free to contact me anytime or the office at grad@mail.wvu.edu. Just one announcement, GSAW, Graduate Student Appreciation Week, will be coming up the first week of April. So be watching for news in our newsletter, a weekly newsletter that you receive every Monday morning, and also on our social media, announcing the different activities that we will have for you for Graduate Student Appreciation Week. In particular, I want to point out on April 3rd, Wednesday evening from 6 to 8, there will be the 3-minute thesis competition grand finale. It's a fun and exciting event for doctoral students to compete in this competition. And the event will be held in the Lair Ballroom, Mountain Lair Ballroom. So please mark it on your calendar and come and join us and see how doctoral students make presentations of their dissertation research in just 3 minutes. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Natalie.
Hi, everyone. You can hear me, right? Yes, Betty, everyone? Yes, I'm assuming folks can hear me. I was having a little problem with my microphone earlier, but as Betty mentioned, my name is Natalie St. Corcoran, and I direct the Writing Studio, and I'm going to be talking with you today about teaching statements. First, I'm going to put a link to the slides in the chat so that you can follow along if you'd like to on your home computer. I know that especially if you're on a very small screen, it can be difficult to kind of toggle back and forth between the things that you might need to as you're attending this presentation. The other thing that I want to mention is that this workshop is interactive. So there isn't, I'm not asking folks to do a lot, but I am asking folks to contribute. So just be mindful of that as I go through these slides. So this is our agenda for today. First, we'll kind of talk about what teaching philosophies are and what their purpose is, what function they serve. And then we'll get kind of quickly into what they include and how to organize in teaching philosophy. We'll look at a sample, and then we'll talk about diversity statements. I only have one slide on that, and how you might incorporate some of your experiences with inclusive excellence in teaching in a teaching statement or teaching philosophy. And you'll find that I may be using those terms interchangeably. So teaching philosophy and teaching statement, I mean the same thing, but they can be referred to differently in the literature. Okay, so here is the first interactive piece. In the chat, if folks wouldn't mind giving me a sense of what you already know about teaching philosophies, so like what function they serve or what they're supposed to look like or how long they're supposed to be, so anything that you know about teaching philosophies. Someone has to be bold and say something. Yay, okay, great. Thank you so much, Elena. Yeah, so no more than 2 pages. Teaching beliefs, yep, thank you, Osama. They include teaching beliefs. Anything else that you guys know? Teaching statements, this is from Natalie. Should be a couple of pages long and detail your stance on how you instruct students. Yep, for sure. So not just beliefs, but also practices, teaching practices, anything else anybody want to add? your idea of what teaching and learning entails, include your teaching style, yep, and how you can apply this to different settings and students. Great, terrific. So you guys already know a lot about teaching philosophies and what they're supposed to do. Let me advance the slide. Yeah, so absolutely. Just as you said, they're typically 1 to 2 pages long, they're reflective, and they indicate what your teaching beliefs are and how you put those beliefs in practice. And I want to stress, and I'll say this a couple of different times, that examples or evidence is crucial in a teaching philosophy or teaching statement. So it's not just enough to say that you have beliefs or values about teaching, but you also have to show how you demonstrate those values. And again, I'll make this point a couple of different times. So that's sort of what it is broadly, but kind of more specifically, they serve a broad function in that they are an opportunity for you to meaningfully reflect on your goals and your actions and your vision in the classroom. They're also an opportunity for you to present yourself as a future employee of a particular institution. So there are usually people have like one teaching philosophy that they send to every institution that they apply to, but there are opportunities to kind of customize a teaching statement, especially if you're aiming for a position at a large land grant institution or a small liberal arts college. So you know, these institutions have, I mean, the same goal in that everybody wants student success and students to graduate, but they recruit different students, they teach to different students, and so there's kind of an opportunity again for you to tailor that teaching statement such that you're presenting yourself as a future employee. And they're also, along those lines, an opportunity to present yourself as a potential colleague in a particular department or program, right? Because departments and programs all have different kinds of personalities, and there are different kinds of things that people value in a colleague, particularly one who's going to be responsible for instructing students. And so this is an opportunity for you to show how you might fit within a particular department. And then that sort of last piece, the hiring committee might also see your statement as indicative of your teaching preferences. So if you happen to mention specific classes in your teaching statement, the hiring committee might see that and say, oh, this person could teach X, Y, or Z class that we already have at this institution. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what should one include? And you've already listed some of these things in the chat. Your thoughts on how students learn, how do they learn best? Your thoughts about how instruction can best help student learning. Your learning goals, your individual, your particular learning goals for the students. Your thoughts about how students should best be evaluated or assessed. And your beliefs about teaching and learning in a changing world. So these are, how do you, it's a lot, right? It's big. Teaching statement asks you to do a lot in a very short space. Okay, now who is the audience and what are their expectations? Well, we already mentioned the audience, but what are their expectations? Again, I'm going to stress, they're going to be looking for clear and specific evidence that you've thought about your philosophies and how to enact them. And that you're indicating your teaching experiences, and they're especially looking for you to be student-centered. So how do you put students first, and then how do you demonstrate that? So there are lots of different kinds of organizational frames. There are lots of different ways to organize teaching philosophy. This isn't the only way, but this is certainly one way. Where in the first paragraph or section, you would indicate your objectives as a teacher. Okay, so what are your goals? What do you hope your students learn in your classrooms? In your second paragraph or section, you talk about how you achieve those goals or objectives. Now I'm aware that some of you might not have teaching experience, and so if you don't, you might talk about how you will help students attain those kind of learning goals. In your third paragraph, you might talk about how you measure success. So, how do you know that your learning goals have been met? What kinds of things do students demonstrate to show you that that your learning goals have been met? And then that fourth paragraph is kind of a broader statement on kind of why you teach and why it's important to you. You know, what's the significance of teaching to you as a professional, as a scholar? You know, how do if you're also looking for a research position, how do your research and teaching speak to each other? But also, you know, kind of what is the value of teaching more broadly, or the significance of it? Okay, so in the chat, I want to show you a possible, this is just sort of a heuristic. So the Google document that's view only, I'm not going to ask you guys to fill this out, should give you some places to start. And the boxes in the left-hand column are meant to kind of cover those paragraphs or sections, those things that you're supposed to include. And then in the right column, you're just meant to brainstorm ideas. So what are your aspirations and goals and objectives? And there's an example. And then again, you know, like notice that this one is also reminding you to describe and give specific examples, what methods you use to reach those goals and objectives, how you assess student understanding, how you see teaching in your discipline, and then this last one, how you'll improve your teaching. So I didn't include that in the list because I don't, some people do include that, but it's not one of those things that you see in every teaching philosophy in the same way that you see these other pieces and parts. But certainly how you will improve your teaching, or how you would like to kind of continue to grow as a teacher. Apologies for kind of scrolling ahead. Does anybody have any questions about the template or how to organize a teaching philosophy?
Are we going to have access to the PowerPoint and stuff after this? Just because I'm driving right now and I'm kind of listening in.
So yeah, if you shoot me an email, Brady, then I can send the link that I posted in the chat to you.
All right, thank you.
Natalie, if you send the PowerPoint to us, we can share.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect. Yeah. And then I see a question here. I'm very new to this topic. Should teaching statements differ depending on your teaching class, methods, approach? I would say that typically there's one teaching philosophy, and what folks end up doing is they might mention other courses as to provide examples of those philosophies in action. Does that help? So you don't have to have like 6 different teaching philosophies if you're teaching, you know, a bunch of different classes. That's usually
I was just wondering if the methods of study would differ depending on the class that we are teaching, and how should we better emphasize our goals. And for example, if we are teaching statistics, it would be something completely different than teaching a comparative class.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, so the content is different, right? But what drives your teaching should be the same, right? So you know, if you're somebody who stresses collaborative learning, that would be the case in either of those classes, regardless of the content. Now the way that you might go about the way that you might go about collaborative learning in those classes might be different, and you could certainly talk about that, but the sort of that value of collaborative learning would be something that you would have, again, regardless of what you were teaching. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Are there other questions? Any other questions?
When you say teaching philosophies, do you mean like teaching philosophies from others, or like are we like kind of crafting our own?
That's a
Like,
great
is it
question.
pre-existing? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is it could be either, right? So my my PhD has a my graduate program had a kind of education element, a pedagogical kind of element, and so I read a lot of teaching theory and practice, and so I did include some of that in my my teaching statement, but I don't think that's a requirement, you know, to that you have to sort of nod to specific kinds of pedagogies, you know, that you have to necessarily be aware of the theory and point to specific authors. But if you have that knowledge, I think that it's beneficial. We're going to look at an example and we can kind of talk through it and address that question a little bit more specifically too, Natalie. But you know, you don't necessarily have to sort of like, you know, comb all the literature to find the thing that kind of best speaks to what you're doing in the classroom in order to kind of ground it more theoretically. You can, but I don't think that you have to. Okay, so I am going to post another link in the chat. So just bear with me for a moment because I lost my document. Here we go. Okay. So this link should take you to a sample teaching statement from a graduate student in biology. And so what I would like us to do is just spend a few minutes reading it, and then we can talk about the things that we like in the teaching philosophy, and then maybe some of the things that, well, we could talk about some of the areas that we think could have been expanded, or things that we'd like to include in our own teaching philosophy. So just take a couple of minutes and then we'll talk about it kind of together. You take another minute on that. It might be frozen. Do I look frozen to you? No, I'm just frozen in my little box. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and advance to the second slide, and let's see if we can answer these questions about the biology teaching statement. So I just want to see your thoughts in the chat. So does the teaching statement, let's start with this first one, offer evidence of practice? Does it offer specific examples? So say yes if you think it does in the chat. I see one yes. Yes. Okay. Anyone else think so? Yes. Okay, two. Yes. Okay. So yes, there are lots of specific examples in each paragraph. Yeah, great. Okay. Is the teaching philosophy student-centered? Does it focus on students, or does it focus on the person as a teacher? What do you guys think? Yeah. So this writer doesn't present themselves as a sage on the stage, right? So where the focus is entirely on them, but on what they're hoping that students can demonstrate after their instruction. Okay. Is the writer reflective? Does it show that they're really thinking about their teaching? Yeah, I agree. I mean, especially that last paragraph, right, where the writer's focusing on what they will do. You know, I will foster interaction in my classroom. Does the writer demonstrate that they actually value teaching, that they think it's a worthwhile endeavor? Okay, so it passes that as well. Yes, certainly. I would say each paragraph speaks to the importance of teaching. And then, is it well written, clear, and readable, which is also really important. Yes. Okay. It is a good draft. I agree with you, Erin. Okay, so it's wordy. And that Amber, you said you had to go back and reread some sentences to understand them. That's true. One of the things that I noticed was that the person kind of jumps back and forth between present tense and past tense in a couple of areas. So I actually couldn't, or future tense, I couldn't tell if it was something that they had done already or that they were going to do in class. So so there was a little bit of an issue with tense. And then Elena, you're saying you found it a little repetitive. Okay, so those are some of the weaknesses. Are there some other kinds of challenges that the student might be running into? Some things that you would do differently? Okay, so they have the basic elements, right? Everybody, for the most part, agrees that they have the basic elements, but they might need to do a little bit of wordsmithing. Definitely. Okay, I agree with you. Now, Natalie, your question about including educational philosophies, do you feel like that's answered with this particular this particular sample? Was it Natalie who asked the question, or am I forgetting? Am I?
It was Natalie. Yeah, I don't feel like they really like cite any historical teaching philosophies throughout, it's like their own philosophy.
Yeah, but I mean, it's certainly grounded in that kind of pedagogy, theory on teaching. But it's not, I think as good teaching is, but it's not like citing or quoting anybody in particular. Okay, Amber, you're helping the student out. They could cut down on the first 2 paragraphs and put more into the last 2. Sure, certainly. Okay, so there was another question up here that I want to make sure that I get to. Ali, you asked, you said a lot of colleges require potential professors, lecturers to submit a teaching philosophy sample without necessarily listing any specific requirements on what to include and explain them. How to approach these requirements as a PhD is looking to be in the academic job market. So Ali, are you asking, so are you saying if an institution in their job ad asks for a teaching statement, but then they don't focus on what you should say in them? You want to know how to approach that? Am I understanding your question, or is there something different that you meant? Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, I think that what we're trying to do in this workshop is talk generally, right, and give you a sense of what all search committees are kind of looking for. So not in terms of content, but in terms of structure, right? Because as far as content goes, people are going to want you, your search committee is going to want you to show that you know, right, your subject matter, your subject area, and you know how to instruct in it, you know how to teach that. But sort of but they are looking at for you to talk about the ways that you do that in a fairly kind of in a way that that meets the general genre conventions. And so I think, Ali, if you were to go back to, say, slide 8 and put your sort of ideas within a general organizational frame, you could use that. So, where in the first paragraph you talk about your objectives, in the second paragraph you talk about how you achieve those objectives, in the third paragraph you talk about how you measure success, and then the fourth paragraph or fourth section, because they aren't necessarily just single paragraphs. Why do you teach and why is it important to you? I think that would be perfectly fine. That would be a perfectly fine approach. Regardless of whether or not they're asking specific questions about, your pedagogy. And in fact, those specific questions will come in during the interview. So they might ask you to kind of elaborate on some of your teaching experiences or apply them in different contexts. Are there any other questions before we move on? Okay. So are there folks online who don't have any teaching experience? You can just type yes in the chat if you'd like to. So, or maybe you don't want to talk about whether or not you do. So I won't spend too much time on it since it seems like everybody has a little bit. But if you don't have teaching experience, then one of the things that I recommend, especially if you're not graduating in May and you've got the time, is to look for opportunities. So where might you gain teaching experience? Are there opportunities with your advisor to assist with individual students? Sometimes it's just a matter of kind of reframing what you're already doing. Are you already mentoring students? Are you already in a lab? Because if you're in a lab, you're serving a kind of supervisory and instructional role. And so you could talk about that experience. You know, have you done research with students, other students? Do you are you kind of a mentor to your peers? You know, have you served a kind of are you more advanced? Are you more further along in your program of study, and you've mentored kind of more junior students, students who are sort of coming in, because kind of mentoring can also be a kind of teaching experience. And then you could also think about who your best teachers were and what you might want to kind of emulate. So what kinds of things would you like to include in your future practice? So if you don't have teaching experience, I encourage you to look for opportunities, and again, think about, you know, what roles you've served that are kind of adjacent to teaching, but also kind of brainstorm who your best teachers were and what made them so. Okay. And then, so the sort of last slide on diversity statements. So I could do, I mean, there's enough content to do an entire presentation on diversity statements. But just a word on them. So I would say diversity statements are relatively new to kind of job application portfolios. And what they ask folks to do is to show the ways in which they've participated in or forwarded inclusive excellence in research, teaching, or service at their institutions. However, within the past couple of years, particularly in red states, there have been efforts to prevent institutions from requiring diversity statements in job packets. But that doesn't mean that discussing equity and inclusion, it wouldn't be important, especially if you have a lot of experience and you know, like really strong feelings and beliefs regarding equity and inclusion. So what I would do is, if you're in that position, is to include information about or your experiences with equity and inclusion in your teaching statements. So if you happen to be somebody from a minoritized community, or you come from a marginalized background, you should certainly and absolutely tell your story. But in telling your story, you should also avoid false parallels and saying that you know, your experience is the same as others' experiences. So you should also focus on common understandings of equity and inclusion. And by common understanding, I just mean sort of how we're talking about it in academia at the institution. So it's not something, this common understanding, it's like Natalie's question about pedagogy. You don't have to have read a lot of the literature or the scholarship on equity and inclusion, but you should be familiar with the conversations in like the Chronicle of Higher Education or Inside Higher Ed that speak to this particular issue. You can and should write about ways that you've supported students from underrepresented backgrounds, highlight any program for underrepresented students that you've participated in, and then write generally about your commitment to equity and inclusion in the classrooms themselves. So it's sort of like diversity statements are like a sticky wicket. Because a lot of institutions, they were requiring them, but now they are no longer. And you might be also cued, though, however, in the job ad, some of them ask you to talk a little bit about your experiences teaching minoritized students, particularly if the school that you're applying to has a particularly a high BIPOC or minoritized population. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. All right. So here are some additional resources, and you're going to get a copy of these slides. So a lot of this information I have lifted, borrowed, or adapted from Iowa State University, University of Minnesota, Mankato, and also there is a 2015 video on teaching philosophies. Okay, I see a couple of questions and I will address those in just a second, but I'm going to move to my last slide. So I mentioned that I was from the writing studio. I encourage you to visit the writing studio as you're working on your teaching statements. Graduate students can work with other graduate student consultants on any writing project. So in addition to things like teaching statements, we can also help with like seminar papers and dissertations and such. So so now I will take your questions. Did I put the link? I did. So I put the link in at the beginning of the session. And so if you joined late, you might not see it, but I can post it again. And then this last one, while this question might be a little off topic, do you have any guidance or suggestions on how to write a research plan? Off the top of my head, Rogerio, I do not, but I can send you some resources if you just pop your email in the chat. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Hold on 1 second if you missed the initial posting of the slideshow, I will post it again. Send this to everyone. There we go. And there it is. Okay, everybody. Thanks. If you'd like to stay on and ask an individual question, then feel free to stick around.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. I did write a question, but I don't think it went through for some reason.
Oh, sorry if I missed it.
Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I just replied to someone individually. I just wanted to ask because you mentioned it should be roughly 1 to 2 pages, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But I'm not sure that we talked about the spacing. So how many words should a statement approximately be?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would say that 2 pages is probably, isn't it about like 600 words or so? Or sorry, one page is like 250, 300 words. And so I would say probably about 600 words. You know what, I have to, now I'm sort of blanking on whether that's single space or double space, 250 words. But
I think 250 is for double space because
double
like
space. So then 1,000. Yeah. So then about 1,000 words. Yeah.
Okay,
and I would say, yeah, and that would be max. So maximum 1,000 words. And I think that some people do play with the margins to try to keep things within the 2 pages, but I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do too much of that, so because I have seen people do like half-inch margins, half inch, half inch, half inch, half inch. And I think that's okay, but I wouldn't do more than that.
That makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Winda posted an event survey, so if you all could take that, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Natalie. If you send the PowerPoint to us and any resources that you would like to share with our students, you can send it to me, and then we'll be sure to share with those who have registered for this workshop.
Okay, I will do that.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay,
And
thanks.
yeah, if there are no further questions, this is the end of the workshop. But if you would like to stay behind, we can keep this Zoom open for a little longer for those of you who would like to speak to Natalie alone.